Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations, the podcast where we explore what really matters in child protection. Today, we're tackling a subject that often sits in the margins of safeguarding practice, but really shouldn't: unregulated settings. Because not every place a child spends time is watched over. Not every setting has trained staff, safeguarding policies, or someone to notice when something's wrong.
I think while some of these places are run, with passion and really good intentions, that others operate in grey areas, outside of the system where oversight is limited or completely absent.
So today we're asking, what happens when people working with children aren't trained, checked, or held accountable? And what's our role in noticing that, even when it's beyond the school gate?
So I think let's just start with the definitions. We're not talking about illegal settings here.
No.
This isn't always about criminal activity or anything. These are clubs or tuition centres, mentoring hubs, faith classes, or part-time provision that don't meet the criteria for Ofsted registration.
Yeah. So they're often legally operating, but without the usual safeguards in place. No inspection, no designated safeguarding lead, no requirement for policies or checks or training.
Yeah, and yet they're still part of some children's weekly lives, and they might be, catch-up tuition in a room of a shop, alternative provision for children who are off-rolled from schools, though I know schools have to ensure that they are regulated. Faith-based learning in halls or homes, sports or performing arts clubs in warehouses, or fields, or sometimes home ed groups meeting in informal spaces.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real, we're talking about, what we call, out of school settings, and they can be really varied. And some are brilliant, in terms of safeguarding. Some really are brilliant, but others, they can be chaotic. They can even be neglectful or abusive. And that's the danger of a space that sits outside any system of oversight.
Yeah, and let's talk about who these settings are often serving. It's not always children who have loads of protective factors around them as well.
Yeah, it's often pupils already struggling in mainstream, children with additional needs, those at risk of exclusion, looked after children, or those on child protection plans, young carers, or those from quite chaotic home situations.
And they're placed in these settings for extra support or as an alternative to school sometimes. But without regulation, that support can easily tip into something unsafe, especially for children who already lack that advocacy, really.
Yeah. So why is that a safeguarding concern? Well, here's what's often missing in an unregulated settings. You can have no DBS checks happening. There's no safeguarding training. And I would just step in and say, having just produced out of school training, the number of approaches that we've had from big and small organisations where the actual level of training is very, very low. And so that, I would say, is quite a common factor. It's at best very limited training. And there's often no first aid provision, no DSL for staff to report concerns to or to manage concerns, and no clear procedures for reporting or recording those concerns.
So, if a child discloses harm or shows signs of distress, there might be no system at all for following that up. No one trained to recognise it, no external body to hold that setting accountable.
Absolutely. And, I want to be really clear, we're not talking about a loophole here. It's a vulnerability.
Yeah, and I remember, children don't know what's regulated and what isn't. To them, a club is a club, a classroom is a classroom, and they expect to be safe.
And some listeners might be thinking, well, we don't place children there, so it's not our responsibility.
But here is the thing, children may be attending these settings out of school hours or after being off-rolled. If we know they're attending, it should be on our radar.
Yeah. So it's going back to my old mantra, once you know, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think, we have to look for patterns. For example, maybe a pupil who comes in tired, they're anxious or withdrawn after attending, a session or weekend group, mentions of harsh discipline, which can often be quite anecdotal, but it's not necessarily that the child is actually wanting to report that something happened. It's picking up on some of these conversations. It can be things like, unsafe surroundings, buildings, outdoor areas, sudden changes in attendance or mood. And again, things like children saying, they were left alone or they weren't supervised properly.
I think it's really important that we say it's not about blaming families or providers. It's about being alert to what children tell us directly or indirectly. And I've had real first-hand experience of this in my first headship, a child who was attending an out-of-school faith group, which many of my children did, and then didn't want to go to PE because he said he'd been made to sit as chicken, which we didn't understand. And it was a form of punishment that the faith teacher used, where the children had to sit in a really uncomfortable position for up to an hour as a punishment. And his punishment was for eating a sweet in the class. And that I had to then refer that on. So it's about listening, and it's about sometimes what they're not saying as much as what they are saying.
Gosh. So what can we do, even if we're not running these settings? What can we
I think
do?
there's some practical steps really, Sam, that we need to be aware of. Ask about out-of-school activities during parents' meetings or pupil conversations. Record any concerns, even if they are happening outside of your setting, and gently advise families. Has this provider shared their safeguarding policy? Have you seen their DBS information? And be cautious about referring children to part-time provision unless it is quality assured and transparent.
And remember, if you're arranging any external provision for a pupil, you remain accountable for safeguarding. So that includes dual registered provision and part-time placements.
I think also that if you notice multiple children attending the same unregulated setting and concerns are raised, your DSL should consider informing the local authority. Certainly in the case of the boy I had, there were a number of children at school who were attending this unregulated faith setting after school. And so therefore there were lots of procedures that I had to then go through to ensure, one, that child was safe, but that other children were safe as well.
That's really at the heart of it, isn't it, Sarah? Children assume someone's watching out for them and that someone will notice if something feels wrong.
But I think if the setting has no training, no policies, no named person, and no oversight, who is watching?
And I think that's why safeguarding has to follow the child, not the institution. And I think it's something we often, and particularly in inspection regimes, it's very setting focused, isn't it? What has the setting got in place to protect children? What is the setting doing? But actually, it's about how does safeguarding apply to that child wherever that child is.
Yeah, and we're not saying that all unregulated settings are dangerous, not at all. Many are doing incredible work, often voluntarily and with no budget.
Yeah, but the absence of oversight is in itself a risk, particularly when a child is already vulnerable.
So I think there's a key question that we need to leave listeners with, actually. Keep asking questions, keep noticing the small signs, keep advocating for children, even in spaces where your responsibility might seem limited.
Absolutely, because harm doesn't always happen where we expect it. And bottom line is, safety should never be optional. I really hope you found this episode useful and share it with your team. And maybe, in your next staff meeting, ask, what do we know about the external settings our pupils attend? Okay, see you next time, and, just leave you with the best safeguarding happens when we look beyond our own walls.